here. The storyline for In His Steps began as a sermon series by the Reverend Charles Sheldon, pastor of the Central Congregational Church in Topeka, Kansas, in 1896. So we're talking a long time ago this book was written. The theme throughout was, what would Jesus do? And the fictional book form that was released shortly after this has sales numbers since that time of between 15 and 20 million copies. It's been that popular a book, translated into numerous languages throughout the world. At that time, there was a large social reform movement that, for example, led to prohibitionism. It was that long ago, before the prohibition took place. The churches focused on alcoholism as a primary cause for broken families tied in with unemployment. They also condemned immoral entertainment at the theaters, greedy capitalism, and newspapers that catered to lurid sensationalism. This was part of a larger movement known as the social gospel, which provided all types of assistance and skills for the poor, the elderly, the victimized, etc. The author himself was a believer in equality of all types, for Jews, for Catholics, for blacks, for women. In that respect, he was a man ahead of his time. According to the Reverend Maxwell, the main character in the novel, who preaches these sermons and revolutionizes both his congregation and his city, if we are to follow in his steps as we are commanded to do in Scripture, we must ask in everything we think and do, what would Jesus do in this situation? For his congregation, the comfortable, respectable, upper-class Christians of the city of Raymond, this call to follow Jesus comes with both a huge commitment and a huge price tag in their personal callings. Some characters follow this pledge, others refuse. And the book demonstrates many examples in how challenging business or media ethics or getting involved in the messy lives of the poor requires great sacrifice and personal loss. But accompanied with that is great peace, fulfillment, and justice, both for those serving and being served. This may be a different century, but the call to true discipleship and the human condition remains the same. The book will present a challenge to every reader related to their own Christian walk. So how will you respond as you look at your own life and ask the question, what would Jesus do? Chapter 1. It was Friday morning, and the Reverend Henry Maxwell was trying to finish up his Sunday morning sermon. He'd been interrupted several times now and was growing nervous as the morning wore away, and the sermon grew very slowly toward a satisfactory finish. Despite what everybody thinks, we try not to spend Saturday putting together a sermon. You want to get it done by Friday night. Mary, he called to his wife as he went upstairs after the last interruption, if anyone comes after this, I wish you would say, I am very busy and cannot come down unless it's something very important. Yes, Henry, but I'm going over to visit the kindergarten and you'll have the house all to yourself. The minister went into his study and shut the door. In a few minutes he heard his wife go out, and then everything was quiet. He settled himself at his desk with a sigh of relief and began to write. His text was from 1 Peter 2:21 that says, "To this you were called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." He had emphasized in the first part of the sermon the atonement as a personal sacrifice for each of us, calling attention to the fact of Jesus' suffering in various ways. in his life as well as in his death. He then went on to emphasize the atonement by the use of examples, giving illustrations from the life and teachings of Jesus to show how faith in Christ helped to save us because of the pattern of character traits he displayed for us to imitate. He was now on to the third and last point, the necessity of following Jesus in his sacrifice by his death and later by an example by his life. He had put down 3 steps. What are they? And was about to enumerate them in logical order when the doorbell rang. It was one of those clockwork bells and always went off as a clock might go if it tried to strike 12 all at once. Henry Maxwell sat at his desk and frowned just a little. He made no movement to answer the bell. Very soon it rang again. Then he rose and walked over to one of his windows, which commanded the view of the front door. A man was standing on the steps. He was a young man, very shabbily dressed. He looks like a tramp, said the minister. I suppose I'll have to go down. And he didn't get to finish his sentence, but he went downstairs and opened the front door. There was a moment's pause as the 2 men stood facing each other. Then the shabby-looking young man said, I'm out of a job, sir, and I thought maybe you might help me in the way of getting some employment. I don't know of anything. Jobs are scarce, replied the minister, beginning to shut the door slowly. I thought you might perhaps be able to give me a contact in the city railway or the superintendent of the shops or someplace else, continued the young man, nervously shifting his faded hat from one hand to the other. Oh, it would be of no use. You'll have to excuse me. I'm very busy this morning. I hope you'll find somewhere to work. Sorry, I can't give you something to do here, but I keep only a horse and a cow, and I do all the work myself. The Reverend Henry Maxwell closed the door and heard the man walk down the steps. As he went up into his study, he saw from his hall window that the man was going slowly down the street, still holding his hat between his hands. There was something in that figure so dejected, homeless and forsaken, that the minister hesitated a moment as he stood looking at him. Then he turned to his desk and with a sigh began to write where he'd left off. He had no more interruptions, and when his wife came in 2 hours later, the sermon was finished, the loose pages gathered up, neatly tied together, and laid on his Bible all ready for the Sunday morning service. A strange thing happened at the kindergarten this morning, Henry, said his wife while they were eating dinner. You know, I went over with Miss Brown to visit the school, and just after the games, while the children were at the tables, the door opened, and a young man came in holding a dirty hat in both hands. He sat down near the door and never said a word. He only looked at the children. He was evidently a tramp, and Miss Wren and her assistant, Miss Kyle, were a little frightened at first. But he sat there very quietly, and after a few minutes he went out. Perhaps he was tired and wanted to rest somewhere. The same man called here, I think. Did he look like a tramp? He said. Yes, very dusty, shabby, downtrodden. Not more than 30 to 33 years old, I should say. The same man, said the Reverend Henry Maxwell thoughtfully. Oh, did you finish your sermon, Henry? His wife asked after a pause. Yes, all done. It's been a very busy week with me. The 2 sermons have turned out to be a lot of work. Oh, but they'll be appreciated by a large audience on Sunday, I hope, replied his wife, smiling. What are you going to preach about in the morning? Following Christ. I take up the atonement as a way of example and sacrifice, and then show the steps needed to follow his example and sacrifice as found in his life and death. Oh, I'm sure it will be a good sermon. I hope it won't rain Sunday. We've had so many stormy Sundays lately. Yes, the audiences have been quite small for some time. Some people will not come out to church in a storm. The Reverend Henry Maxwell sighed as he said it. He was thinking of the careful, laborious effort he had made in preparing sermons for large audiences that failed to appear. But Sunday morning dawned on the town of Raymond, one of the most perfect days that sometimes comes along after long periods of wind and mud and rain. The air was clear and bracing. The sky was free from all threatening signs, and most everyone in Mr. Maxwell's parish prepared to go to church. When the service opened at 11 o'clock, the large building was filled with an audience of the best dressed, most well-to-do looking people of Raymond. The First Church of Raymond believed in having the best music that money could buy, and its quartet choir this morning was a source of great pleasure to the congregation. The anthem was inspiring. All the music was in keeping with the subject of the sermon, and the anthem was an elaborate adaptation to the most modern music of the hymn, Jesus, I my cross have taken, all to leave and follow thee. Just before the sermon, the soprano sang a solo, the well-known hymn, Where he leads me I will follow. I'll go with him all the way. Rachel Winslow looked very beautiful that morning as she stood up behind the screen of carved oak, which was significantly marked with the emblems of the cross and the crown. Her voice was even more beautiful than her face, and that was saying a great deal. There was a general rustle of expectation from the audience as she rose. Mr. Maxwell settled himself contentedly behind the pulpit. Rachel Winslow's singing always assisted his sermons. He generally arranged for a song before the sermon. It made possible a certain inspiration and a mood that just made his delivery more impressive. People said to each other they had never heard such singing even in the first church. It's certain that if it had not been a church service, her solo would have been vigorously applauded. It even seemed to the minister when she sat down that something like an attempted clapping of hands swept through the church. He was a bit startled by it. As he rose, however, and laid his sermon on the Bible, he said to himself he'd only imagined it. Of course it would not occur, not in this church. In a few moments he was absorbed in his sermon, and everything else was forgotten in the smoothness of his delivery. No one had ever accused Henry Maxwell of being a dull preacher. On the contrary, he had often been charged with being sensational. Not in what he said so much as in the way of saying it. But the first church people liked that. It gave their preacher and their parish a pleasant distinction that was noticeable. It was also true that the pastor of the first church loved to preach. He seldom exchanged pulpits. He was eager to be in his own pulpit when Sunday came. There was an exhilarating half hour waiting for him as he faced a church full of attentive people and knew that he had a hearing. He was particularly sensitive to variations in attendance. He never preached well before a small audience. The weather also decidedly affected him. He was at his best before just such an audience as he faced now, on just such a morning. He felt a glow of satisfaction as he preached on. The church was premier in the city. It had the best choir. It had a membership composed of the leading influential people, representative of the wealth, the society, and the intelligence of Raymond. He was going abroad on a 3-month vacation in the summer, and the circumstances of his pastorate, his influence, and his position as pastor of the first church in the city were unchallenged. It's not certain that the Reverend Henry Maxwell knew just how he could quietly display these feelings in connection with his sermon, but as he drew near the end of it, he knew that at some point in his delivery, he had conveyed all of them. They had entered into the very substance of his content. It might have been all in a few seconds of time, but he'd been conscious of defining his position, and his delivery partook of the thrill of deep personal self-gratification. The sermon was quite interesting. It was full of striking sentences. They would have commanded attention if printed. Spoken with the passion of dramatic utterance that had the good taste never to offend his listeners with a suspicion of ranting or judgment, they were very effective. If the Reverend Henry Maxwell that morning felt satisfied with the condition of his pastorate, the first church also had a similar feeling as it congratulated itself on the presence in the pulpit of this scholarly, refined, somewhat striking face and figure, preaching with such animation and yet free of all vulgar, trite, or uncomfortable mannerisms. But suddenly, into the midst of this perfect concord between preacher and audience, there came a very remarkable interruption. It would be difficult to indicate the extent of the shock which this interruption caused. It was so unexpected, so entirely contrary to any inkling of any person present, that it offered no room for consideration or, for the time being, resistance. The sermon had come to a close. Mr. Maxwell had just turned the half of the big Bible over onto his manuscript and was about to sit down as the quartet prepared to arise to sing the closing selection, All for Jesus, All for Jesus, when the entire congregation was startled by the sound of a man's voice. It came from the rear of the church, from one of the seats under the gallery. The next moment, this man came out of the shadows and walked down the middle aisle. Before the startled congregation barely realized what was going on, the man had reached the open space in front of the pulpit and had turned around facing the people. "I've been wondering since I came in here," they were the words he used under the gallery, and he repeated them, "if it would be the right thing to say a word at the close of the service. I'm not drunk, and I'm not crazy, and I am perfectly harmless. But if I die, as there is every likelihood I shall in a few days, I want the satisfaction of thinking that I had my say in a place like this and before this sort of a crowd." Henry Maxwell had not taken his seat, and he now remained standing, leaning on his pulpit, looking down at the stranger. It was the man who had come to his house the Friday before, the same dusty, worn, shabby-looking young man. He held his faded hat in his two hands. It seemed to be a favorite gesture. He had not been shaved, and his hair was rough and tangled. It's doubtful if anyone like this had ever confronted the first church within the sanctuary. It was a tolerably familiar scene with this sort of humanity out on the street, around the railroad shops, but no one ever dreamed of such an incident in the sanctuary here. Well, there was nothing offensive in the man's manner or tone. He was not excited. He spoke in a low but distinct voice. Mr. Maxwell was conscious, even as he stood there, smitten into dumb astonishment at this spectacle, that somehow the man's action reminded him of a person he had once seen walking and talking in his own sleep. No one in the church made any motion to stop the stranger or in any way to interrupt him. Perhaps the first shock of his sudden appearance deepened into a genuine perplexity concerning what was best to do. However that may be, he went on as if he had no thought of interruption and no thought of the unusual element which he had introduced into the decorum of the first church service. And all the while he was speaking, the minister leaned over the pulpit, his face turning white and sad. But he made no movement to stop him, and the people sat spellbound into breathless silence. One other pale face, that of Rachel Winslow from the choir, stared intently down at the shabby figure with the faded hat. Her face was striking at any time. Under the pressure of this present unheard of incident, it was as personally distinct as if it had been framed in fire. I'm not an ordinary tramp, though I don't know of any teaching of Jesus that makes one kind of tramp less worth saving than another. Do you? He put the question as naturally as if the whole congregation had been a small Bible class. He paused just a moment and coughed painfully. Then he went on. I lost my job 10 months ago. I'm a printer by trade. The new linotype machines are beautiful specimens of invention, but I know 6 men who have killed themselves within the year just on account of those machines. Of course, I don't blame the newspapers for getting the machines. Meanwhile, what can a man do? I know I never learned but one trade, and that's all I can do. I've walked all over the country trying to find something. There are a good many others like me. I'm not complaining, am I? Just stating facts. But I was wondering as I sat there under the gallery if what you call following Jesus is the same thing as what he taught. What did he mean when he said, "Follow me"? The minister said, here he turned about and looked up at the pulpit, that it's necessary for the disciple of Jesus to follow in his steps. And he said the steps are obedience, faith, love, and imitation. But I didn't hear him tell you just what he defined that to mean, especially the last step. What do you Christians mean by following in the steps of Jesus? I've wandered through this city for 3 days trying to find a job, and in all that time I've not had a word of sympathy or comfort except from your minister here, who said he was sorry for me and hoped I would find a job somewhere. I suppose it's because you get so imposed upon by the professional tramp that you've lost your interest in any other sort. I'm not blaming anybody, am I? Just stating facts. Of course, I understand you can't all go out of your way to hunt up jobs for other people like me. I'm not asking you to. But what I feel puzzled about is what is meant by following Jesus. What do you mean when you sing, "I'll go with him all the way"? Do you mean that you're suffering and denying yourselves and trying to save lost souls, suffering humanity just as I understand Jesus did? What do you mean by it? I see the ragged edge of things a good deal. I understand there are more than 500 men in the city in my case. Most of them have families. My wife died 4 months ago. I'm glad she's out of this trouble. My little girl is staying with a printer's family until I find a job. Somehow I get puzzled when I see so many Christians living in luxury and singing, "Jesus, I my cross have taken, all to leave and follow thee." And then I remember how my wife died in a tenement in New York City, gasping for air and asking God to take our little girl too. Of course, I don't expect you people to prevent everyone from dying of starvation, lack of proper nourishment, and foul tenement air. But what does following Jesus mean? I understand that Christian people own a good number of tenements. A member of a church was the owner of the one where my wife died. And I've wondered if following Jesus all the way was true in his case. And I heard some people singing at a church prayer meeting the other night as they sang, "All for Jesus, all for Jesus." And I kept wondering as I sat on the steps outside just what they meant by it. It seems to me there's an awful lot of trouble in the world that somehow wouldn't exist if all the people who sing such songs went and put the principles into practice. I suppose I don't understand, but what would Jesus do? Is that what you mean by following in his steps? It seems to me sometimes as if the people in the big churches had fine clothes and nice houses to live in and money to spend for luxuries and could go away on summer vacations and all that, while the people outside the churches, thousands of them I mean, die in shabby tenements and walk the streets for jobs and never have a piano or a picture in the house and grow up in misery and drunkenness and sin. The man suddenly gave an awkward lurch in the direction of the communion table and laid one grimy hand on it. His hat fell on the carpet at his feet. A stir went through the congregation. Dr. West half rose from his pew, but as yet the silence was unbroken by any voice or movement in the audience worth mentioning. The man passed his other hand across his eyes, and then, without warning, he just fell heavily on his face at full length up the side. And Henry Maxwell spoke. "We will consider the service closed." I hope that you will think about this chapter this next week and ask yourselves the question, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do in this church? What would he have us do?